So this is Jacoby. This is everybody, and you'll see us from both ends of the table. Can you just do a little?
So mute myself.
Okay, now you're muted. Can we get another test? Yes, you are muted now. Can you test your sound and tell us hello?
Me or Kyler?
Yeah, you. Sorry. Oh, you can't see me. That I'm staring at you. I can hear you. Excellent. And our mic, this also serves as a mic, so I can pass it around when folks have questions. So,
cool.
Everybody, this is Jacoby Ballard. And I'm gonna let him introduce himself, but I've known Jacoby, I feel like over 10 years now. We've been doing yoga, social justice activism together for a really long time. He's a very deep influence on me and my work. And just so thrilled to have you here, Jacoby. Jacoby has always taught me how to be the radical squeaky wheel with total compassion and empathy and expansiveness. That's how I would describe it. And I feel like you've always played this role of like lovingly and skillfully calling in and calling up. And I'll let you speak to that more, but just so grateful to have you here. I need to stop turning this so I can see your face so you can keep seeing everybody. And I let Jacoby know that we would really extend and weave our conversation about gender and some of the stuff you read, not just in his book, but in the Kaufman book. So I asked him to share more of his personal story as an activist and as a parent, parenting his child in a gender expansive way. So welcome, Jacoby.
Thank you so much. Oh. Do y'all know the ASL way of applause, which is this? Just really useful on Zoom these days. It's really wonderful to see you all. I'm really looking forward to getting to know you all. I'm so excited to be invited back into this class. Hala and Tessa, thank you for having me. Thank you for that introduction, Hala. I feel like it's been a work in progress how I transitioning from calling out to calling in and divesting from methods of guilt and shame and judgment, imagining that those are transformative forces and into practices of forgiveness and accountability and compassion. So thank you for being with me in that process. So I've been teaching yoga for about 20 years. I've been doing activism for about the same timeline. I became an activist on my own college campus, a similar liberal arts college to Pitzer. And for me, one of the joys of that, being on a campus of 2,000 people and a pretty well-resourced campus as well, was being able to really make an influence, make an impact on the campus. If there was a speaker that we wanted to come, we figured out the departments and the pockets of funds to bring them. And if there was something that we wanted to, a protest or a convention that we wanted to attend, over the course of my 4 years there, we found more and more ways to fund that as well. So during my own college activism, I had my college paid for me to go to the School of the Americas protests in Georgia several years in a row, protesting U.S. training of militias abroad, as well as attending the UN summits on climate change and sustainable development. So I just say that because to hand down that, like, being where you are at Pitzer is really important, and you can really find ways that Pitzer can support you, and that can also support Pitzer in being the campus that they want to be. Because when I went to a UN conference, right, that was like great publicity for my college. I began my meditation practice in high school as a high school athlete and a student leader, while also having survived years of bullying for being seen as queer. I wasn't out as queer at the time, but meditation allowed me to really focus my mind such that I became an unstoppable free throw shooter. I was the player that the team turned to at the final minutes of the game to get fouled, and I had spent so much time training my attention through meditation that I could transfer that onto the basketball court quite easily. Um, and that was compelling to me because it, this thing that I was doing as like a side project became a way that it was living my life even better. Um, and then also looking back, meditation allowed me to survive the years of bullying and the world telling me that I should be someone and something other than who I am. Taught me that there's something inside that can't be harassed, that can't be talked smack about, that can't be violated. Um, and then on my college campus, I was mandated to take yoga because there was a wellness credit that uh, we had to fulfill by the end of our sophomore years. And so, come the second semester of my sophomore year, I hadn't yet fulfilled it. And so I got a note from the registrar saying, "You must take yoga or you will not graduate in 2 years." I'm so grateful for being mandated to take yoga, having been an athlete. My relationship with my body was previously very forceful and um, just kind of making it do things that my mind wanted it to do, whether that was like hiking a 14,000-foot mountain or doing 50 suicides in the basketball gym. Um, and yoga really continues to shift my relationship to my body to be more attentive and listening um, uh, and gentle, knowing that systems of oppression in this world have really wrought havoc on our individual body, heart, minds. And so um, it's resting and gentleness are counter practices to productivity and proving ourselves and performativity um, that the world around of us demands. Um, about I don't know 6 or 7 years into my so I had like my meditation and my yoga practice and then my activism and um, in those different worlds they were judging one another, right? Activism saying, there's not time to take a retreat. There's how dare you not be at the press conference and be in a yoga class? Uh, how dare you take care of yourself, essentially, which is still present in our social justice movements, but so much less so than it was 20 years ago. A lot of our movement organizations have really taken on healing justice, led by women of color. Um, and at the same time, yoga and Buddhist meditation spaces were not willing to look at systems of oppression and how the systems of oppression are present in any room that we are in, right? Because we've all drank the Kool-Aid, and so unless we're intentionally intervening in white supremacy and transphobia and misogyny and ableism, then we're going to be reproducing it. And so part of my work has been like figuring out ways to shift conversations within yoga and Buddhist spaces to grapple with really big questions, I think, of compassion, really big questions about like how do we love everyone who's present um, on the planet and in our movements, and how do we listen and slow down when different groups of people are telling us indeed that they are not feeling loved and cherished and um, strengthened or emboldened by any given community. Um, yeah, so I've done along those lines, so I've done consulting for like yoga and Buddhist organizations such as Off the Mat Into the World that I met Hala and Tessa through, um, and trying to do the work of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, um, which shifting institutions is slow, steady work, and the urgency that I cultivated in my activism for years. It's just um, that doesn't that can I found that often burns bridges rather than allowing me to construct stronger bridges. Um, and so my practice allows me to like be in activism for the long haul, um, thinking about harm reduction rather than complete systems change, even as I aspire towards total systems change. Um, yeah, and then I guess to talk a little bit about my parenting journey. So I'm a transmasculine person. Have been queer identified for about 20 years, and I carried and birthed our our kiddo, who is now 3, and interacted with the birth work world that expects straight women to be the ones that are carrying and birthing children. And so um, I put together, my partner and I put together a fabulous birth work team of a midwife and acupuncturist and chiropractor um, and doula. They were all great, but the greater birth work world was and remains very homophobic, transphobic, and heterosexist. Um, and so through that experience, I've begun consulting for prenatal yoga teacher trainings and birthwork organizations and businesses on LGBTQ inclusion. Um, and I guess I want to say that that some of us opt into that work, right? And um, it's really important for me to like nourish myself and be surrounded by community. I often think of like having like a queer love cloak around me as I like head into these spaces that perhaps are not expecting or anticipating people like me. Um, and at the same time, I'm trying to like leave these spaces cleaner than I found it, right? That the next generations of trans folks and queer folks that are bringing kids into the world won't face as many barriers uh, that I or even generations before me have faced. Um, I'll also say that part of our entrance into parenthood is a very queer division of labor. My partner induced lactation, so even though she wasn't the birth parent, she took hormones and pumped to induce her own body to produce milk, which is something that adoptive parents have done, and some non-gestational parents have done as well over years. Um, and For us, that's been really wonderful, right? That intimate work doesn't just fall on one of us. That I did the like 9 months of like carrying baby around and bringing baby out into the world, uh, and my partner does the intimate work of continuing to chest feed our kiddo. Um, and then in terms of parenting gender expansively, some of it at this point is it can be more spacious than like Gigi is just 3 years old. So as he becomes more clear about his preferences in the world and the words that feel nourishing to his being, then that will our responsibility as his parents are to shift our practices. But up until now, we call him our kiddo, our babe. We don't use words like son or boy for him just because we want to provide a huge amount of options for him. Um, Similarly, we dress him. If y'all, in most clothing stores, it's divided by like men's clothes and women's clothes. Although that's shifting a little bit, and we shop for him in both areas. Um, and we tend to, so he was assigned male at birth. There's like a 2% chance that he'll be non-binary or trans. So it's likely that he's going to be identified himself as a boy and then as a man. And then there's a 10% chance that he'll be gay. So chances are he's going to be a cisgender straight white man. But who knows? And we want to provide a lot of options for him. So knowing that the world is going to force masculinity upon him and really limit his choices in the world, we're purposely trying to like put everything on the table and give him every option, and even tend towards what is considered more girl or femme, to balance out the harsh masculinity that's going to rain down on him. So we offer him many more rainbows and flowers and unicorn options than we do dump trucks and sports and like dinosaurs. Although, if we're in a store or if he sees something in particular that he prefers, we're going to honor that. If he's like, I want the dinosaur glasses instead of the rainbow glasses, we honor that, of course. But I think one of the ways that I've found that boys and men are dehumanized is to really limit choices. That there's certain ways to walk, that there's certain ways to certain instruments that are okay to play. There's certain sports that are more masculine or feminine. And so for as long as we can, we're just trying to protect him from those influences. And then at some point, that will be the constant conversation that we have at our breakfast table and our dinner table, right? Is like those expectations that the world puts upon him and who he is amongst those expectations and his own preferences. And I guess I'll also say, in terms of gender expansive parenting, that it's I feel really sad when I drop him off at daycare and both, this morning he was wearing pigtails and barrettes and tight little pants. And so another parent just assumed that he's a little girl and referred to him with the wrong pronouns. At this point, we don't correct those pronouns because Gigi doesn't seem to have a preference himself, and we don't necessarily want to go into the whole gender conversation and gender expansive parenting conversation just as we're just there to drop off our kid at daycare, as every other parent is. And at the same, and also, bearing witness to the gender binary being forced upon children at such a young age, which influences like the clothes that they wear and the things that they play with in the classroom. And for me, it's, how I parent is very much part of my spiritual practice. It's a constant practice of acceptance and equanimity and compassion and loving kindness. I was interviewed by one of my Buddhist teachers yesterday for her podcast, and she asked me how parenting has shifted my practice. And what I said is that it's given me much less time for formal practice on my cushion and on my mat, but many more opportunities to apply the teachings that I write about in my book. That, so many moments of joy, like, oh my God, there's a compost truck out the window. This is like the delight of the morning at the breakfast table, or the gazillions of tantrums and like the little attachments that Gigi can have to small things, and how I work with that, or the moments that I'm not able to and I struggle with him and engage in a power struggle. All of those are opportunities to employ these practices that I've been cultivating for a couple of decades. So happy to be in conversation with you, take any questions. I know you were engaged earlier talking about performative activism. I think that's a really rich conversation. Anything else that came up through the chapters of my book that you read, as well as anything about gender and yeah.
I'll start with a lot of questions. Jacoby, can you hear me when I'm talking here?
Yes, kind of. Maybe take the mic.
How's this? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, much better. Yeah.
So weird that a speaker is a mic. This is like a brand new discovery for me, right? Who knew? One thing I'd like to ask you about is, you talked about, and I've gotten to share part of this journey of the calling out, like how, living in a body and in a life where there's constant microaggressions, constant macroaggressions, constant reasons to be angry, right? And you talk about anger in your book. And I'm curious how you might share your own, this is not an overnight thing that you went from being like reactive and angry to like this peaceful, calm, yet radical, practitioner. And I'm wondering if you can share with us like some of the pivotal moments. Some might have been external events, some might have been internal shifts that allowed you on that journey. Because, I know when I was these folks' age, y'all are so much more mature than I was, because when I was your age, I hated everybody because I was right and they were wrong. And I loved when people were wrong because I could call them out on it. You all are engaging in conversations I never had, but I'm wondering, Papa Bear, I'm seeing your shirt. If you might just share some of the, a couple of things from your journey that ushered you to this place.
Yeah, it's a great question. I still get angry. It's inevitable. I feel like if you care about this world, if you care about your own community and other communities that are constantly under assault, so part of it has just been shifting my relationship with anger itself and seeing, as I write in the chapter about anger, the wisdom of anger and how important anger is, and that underneath anger is a broken heart and a sense of overwhelm and exhaustion. So part of it is listening to my anger and also learning to not generally speak or act in the midst of like the heat overcoming my body. And like I know that like when I'm angry my voice speeds up and I'm leaning in and have a lot of adrenaline coursing through my body. I've learned that I'm not my most skillful in that moment. Like I'm likely to take someone's head off. Hala and I were once in a training together where we had it was just the opening of the training, and people were giving their name and where they're from and their pronouns, and people were avoiding the pronoun question, and it was like going like person by person by person, and it was pissing me off because some of us, that's like one of the forms of dehumanization and violence that we face, is that microaggression of not having our pronouns respected, either intentionally or by mistake. And so Hala leaned over to me and grabbed my hand. It was like, do you want to take this one or should I? Which I think is so moments like that have been like pivotal moments of like knowing that like someone else that's like not directly impacted can take it, and can definitely see what's happening in the room, but not necessarily have the like embodied response in the way that I was. And what I told Hala in that moment is, I'm going to take their heads off and cut all the bridges in the room, so you better take it, right? I've also learned, that calling out doesn't usually get me what I want, which I want people to act better. I want people to be loving. I want people to see the humanity of me, of my loved ones, communities I care about, people that are different than them, as well as people in their own communities, right? And so shame and blame and the punishment don't get us there. And I find that the prison abolition movement is saying the same thing, like that you can incarcerate a white supremacist, but that doesn't end white supremacy, right? That still exists. And so we have to dig in and do the hard work of transforming one another's hearts. And I know that the way to do that is through connectivity. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that like it's always my work to build connection with someone who has just dehumanized me as a queer person or trans person, right? Like I'm not sitting down at the table with the governor of Texas right now, um, but I can allow other people to do that work, um, and trust again that like that behavior is coming out of a place of ignorance and lack of relationship. And so one of the ways to heal that is through building relationship and providing information. Um, it's really easy to dehumanize someone that's like far away or that you don't know anything about the details of their lives, and really difficult to dehumanize someone that you've had dinner with and that your kids have grown up together. Um, so I think for me, like feeling into like, what do I really want when I'm angry? Like what is the world that my anger is calling for? Really listening to that, and um, then once the energy of anger has coursed through my body, figuring out ways to employ that wisdom and connect. And I guess another thing, the Hala, that I would say in terms of like a pivotal moment is I saw myself losing friends. Like after I graduated college, and I was just like Hala, probably like looking around, seeing like, oh, you're racist and you're destroying the environment and you're sexist and you're like pointing the finger everywhere was destroying relationships. And so then one of my closest friends said, it's really hard to be close with you because I'm afraid of getting called out every time we hang out. And that's a really uncomfortable place to be. Um, and luckily I was able to really listen to that friend who's remained a good friend 20 years later. But if I hadn't shifted, we wouldn't be good friends anymore.
Ooh, I resonate with that one, Jacoby. I remember going to my family Christmas dinner and deciding I was going to make my own vegan food for the meal, and I just sat and talked at that the whole meal. Like I was awful to do.
Yeah, and it's part of it is like a hard lesson that we are the only ones we can control. So I can show up at a holiday meal and eat vegan food, but I can't make anyone else eat vegan, and it doesn't make the meal any better for me if I'm judging everyone else for what they are eating.
Exactly. Exactly.
Hi, I'm Leonard, and my question is kind of about like sports and physicality. As like a high school athlete, and then getting into yoga, and now as like an adult that has done a lot of yoga. And because I started doing yoga this semester, I took a class, and I was like a two-sport athlete in high school, and even through half of my career in college, I was. And I was kind of curious your relationship and understanding of sport and like how sports are introduced to children as being like very aggressive and like draining, as like you have to exert yourself all the way to be doing physical sports, and how you're thinking about that as like you're raising a child, and like how you would like to introduce them to like their bodies, and being like sports are good and being active is good, but without being like you don't need to be like killing yourself every day to do it.
That is such a good question. I haven't really begun to think about that in terms of my kid and my parenting. So thank you for offering me an opportunity with that. Um, One of the things I think about is the pressure of competition, to like always be the best, and who that leaves behind, right? Like even just when I was driving, there's an elementary school a couple blocks from our house, and yesterday when we were passing it, my kiddo noticed that all the kids were like running, but some of the kids were walking, and I was just like really thinking about those kids that are walking and like what they're learning about their physical bodies in that moment in relationship to everyone else, and kind of the humiliation, right? Like they have a choice to like either listen to their bodies and walk, and at the same time like be the fat kid or the slow kid, or anything else that's like judged, and it's like you don't want to be that kid. And how that, like, if that's how that could continue for their lifetime, right? um, I think it'd be really wonderful to shift sports into like participation rather than competition. Like, how can we all be here together, and how can we all be learning together? Which, you know, some people might be learning different skills at the same time, but trusting, I think, that each of us have gifts to offer any space that we're in. Each of us have different skills to and gifts to offer any team that we might be on. And so then how do we value, you know, both the kid that can slam dunk and also the kid that is really incredible at strategy, and not just like prioritizing one kind of embodiment or one kind of way of thinking, but um, how can we include everyone for the betterment of all of us?
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, kind of speaking more, oh, sorry, I'm Ella. Speaking more to the idea of inclusivity, not that at all that you have to represent the entire queer community, but if you could maybe provide one or two examples of what inclusivity would look like, either for you or your community, besides just pronouns.
Yeah. The first thing that comes to mind is everyone knowing what's going on for queer communities in this moment, right? There's 200, I was just telling Tessa last week, there's 266 bills in state legislatures right now that are anti-queer, and about 125 of those are anti-trans. So just having like people that, most of us that are queer and most of us that are trans know that that's happening, right? Like, that's our own lives that are at stake, and those the folks that we're working with in therapy, those are the children that we're like raising ourselves. So just having that awareness, like taking on the policies that are negatively impacting any one community and making that part of your own context of what's happening in the world, and and then considering, what do I have to offer, right? Like, do I know the brother of a state senator, or can I talk to my city councilman because, like, say, like, there's something we have in common, like he's an athlete, I'm an athlete, or you know, he's Latinx, I'm Latinx, or something like that, in order to like finding common ground in ways that we can, in order to shift from that place of connectivity, to shift conversation perhaps on other issues. Yeah, and then I guess the other things that comes to mind, I'm always thinking about like who's at the margins of queer communities, and it's right now trans women of color, and so um, it would be amazing if like everyone here, like, if you can notice trans people around you, even if, you know, uh, even if that it's like making an assumption, but committing to like protecting us in the locker rooms and bathrooms that you go into, to ensure that when you're in a bathroom, no trans person is going to be dehumanized there. No one's going to be kicked out. No one's going to be given a dirty look. And if you see something going down, like imagining how you're going to interfere. Like, are you going to make eye contact with the trans woman and like just let her know, like, I'm with you and I see what's going down, and like if it escalates, I'm in it. Or if there's other skills and tools that you can use in that moment. Any of the like binary gender spaces or places that we're most threatened, so homeless shelters, prisons and jails, domestic violence shelters sometimes, anything that's divided by binary gender. So showing up, like, because those places really work for cisgender people. So kind of cultivating a expansion from the inside.
Your hand over here.
Hi. I don't know if you can see me, but
Yep.
I'm Sophie. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciated your explanation of kind of the differences between both individually and collectively working through anger and the ways in which it's important to engage in this work, and we have to address the anger and not let that boil up and escalate, and kind of come out in ways that are counterproductive to the things that we care about and the work that we're doing. And I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit more to maybe some of your own experiences, kind of as you do in the chapter, or just more broadly about when it's beneficial to work through kind of anger on your own, and kind of sit with that personally, and then when is it more necessary to work through anger and frustration kind of in a collective community space.
Yeah, really great question. I think it can be tricky to work with collectively because sometimes anger wants an enemy, right? And so sometimes we can make enemies out of our closest friends, or in connecting with one another to make an enemy that's not present, there can sometimes be like a dehumanization of that person. But I think I guess so it is important to take it on individually and not just when you get mad, but knowing that like the conditions of our world are heartbreaking, and there's going to be, every time I turn on the news, there's something to anger me. And so then having self-care practices to discharge it on a regular basis, anticipating that it's going to come up. For me, one of the things that I do is running, just so like I'm such a better person after I go for a run because I've like physically exerted, and that like I could like channel the anger, the energy of anger into my runs to like go faster, go harder, whatever. So that then I'm not bringing that energy into a conversation with a loved one or at like a coalition meeting where I'm like meeting with someone important. And then, in times like this, times of war, right? Or moments like, for me, like after Trump was elected, it's even more important to like double down on your self-care practices and your discharge practices. So many people I know right now are so triggered by war, right, happening in Ukraine, and sometimes feeling powerless too, right? Like, what can any one of us do to stop it? One of the things we can do is nourish ourselves so that we are steady and connected and bring an open heart. And then from that, like creating households and communities and organizations where the smaller forms of violence that eventually could escalate to something like war, the smaller forms of violence are intercepted and dealt with so that it doesn't have to escalate. And then I think we can, really encourage each other in self-care practices and discharge practices. Like my partner is often like, okay, it's Wednesday. Did you go for your run? You're supposed to go for your run today. Or just like removing obstacles, or sometimes like we might drag ourselves in, onto the soccer field or something, not really wanting to do it, but trusting that it's good for us, and it can really help to have a buddy just like that to get there into the practices that we know we need that nourish us.
Thank you.
Hello, my name's Keenan. Thank you so much for coming today.
Hi, Keenan.
My question's a little bit more lighthearted, I guess, or like not quite as serious. You mentioned earlier about kind of like fashion and how it's like boys and girls clothes are like very segregated, and like how like that, and they're like very like color schemes are very much like associated with the two, like kind of like the two dominant genders kind of in society and stuff, and how I feel like, I mean, like for myself, I would say that like one thing that's been really hard is that I've always been more drawn to like a femme like color scheme, but like women's clothes don't work for me. Like I've bought women's clothes like short and they like don't fit. Like I felt like I like have had way more like wardrobe malfunctions than I would want, and so like, which like not appropriate at all. And so but it's hard because I'm like, and they're labeled women's, and I feel like it's like very like anti-trans to be labeled that way, but also I'm like, they don't fit my body, they don't work for my body because I'm like male bodied. And so like, and I've thought about going into fashion of like, I want to create clothes that like I like the color scheme and also like fit my body and can work, and I can work out in them, and they don't like reveal parts of me that I don't want to be revealed like by accident. And so like I'm wondering if you have any ideas of like not to be like so segregated, but also like to be inclusive, because I'm like, I mean, I'm cis. I've never kind of like really been questioning over kind of like what aisle to go in or whatever. Like, do I go to the male section? Do I go to the women's section? Like that was never a part of me growing up. Really, that was always like I was a boy. I kind of fit into that. And so like I'm just wondering, like, do you have any thoughts on like how that could progress, or like any solutions to that? Like, while like different bodies are different bodies and they like work differently and they have to be like made differently, but also to be inclusive, and like yeah, just kind of on that idea.
Yeah, totally. Great question. Yeah, there are clothing companies that are anticipating you. They're out there, and so part of it is finding them and supporting them. Um, and then also I'm thinking of people like Billy Porter and Jonathan Van Ness, right, who are also assigned male at birth and dress in all kinds of fabulous clothing. Um, just like following other people that have similarly want to wear those kinds of clothes that it sounds like you want to wear, that also were not necessarily designed with their bodies in mind. And just like using it as a like opportunity for research, like how do they do it? Like they make it work for them. How? And then I think, I slowly see, I even saw a coverage from like this year's like Fashion Week in New York that like it's shifting, and like some department stores, like I'm seeing like more and more like this is a like all gender shirt or whatever. And so when we see that, like offering affirmation to the company, the corporations that are taking a leap of faith and doing that. But it's also tricky because during Pride Month, I see like all kinds of companies saying that like trying to make money off of queer people just because they slap a rainbow on something, and that's but at the same time they're still like invested in the Republican Party that are like enacting all of these anti-trans policies, right? So having like a critical eye around it, because like corporations mainly just want to make profit, but at the same time when we see them responding to shifting social demands, supporting them in that, it's kind of a tricky navigation.
Yeah, thank you.
Jacoby?
Yes.
So Booker brought up in her talk
about right speech. Is it true? Is it kind? Is it necessary to be said by me? Is it necessary to be said at this time? Which you first introduced me to years ago, and I like want to slap it on my forehead or on my kitchen table, wherever I can see it all the time, because it's so good and so hard in a moment when you're not feeling kind or true, or caring if it's necessary. So how, and we talked about it a little bit in class the other day. You know, when you're speaking truth to power, you're not always doing so kindly. Or are you? Like, you know, how do we really, when there's also really complicated, hard truths about this bill that we're going to protest that is really denigrating the rights and dignity of trans folks, right? It's coming from a kindness for love of humanity that all can be seen for their humanity and dignity.
Yeah.
But our words might come forcefully and with a lot of critique and judgment, right? So like, how do we navigate, right? That when we know we're actually coming with critique and judgment, and yet we also feel like it's necessary to be said, and it's necessary to be said by us, it's necessary to be said by us now, and it's true. But is it kind, right? Like, so these are really complicated standards to live up to, and I just want to know, like, in the real here and now, as we're going about our activist work, and also really trying to do it from a mindful way, how do you suggest navigating those tensions? Do you want to respond to it, or do you want? Can I add to it? Yes, we have an addition to an amendment.
Well, I had a not fleshed out thought, and then you just like triggered something. So I feel like I have those experiences a lot with like my parents, and so like the kind of language when I'm trying to like bring awareness to something, and like not necessarily calling out, but also like critiquing when I feel like it needs to be said in a circle where that's not what people would think, or like parents or adults who weren't raised in a certain way and don't have certain awareness of certain issues, like how to not call out, but kind of critique or like, you know, bring things up when contradictions need to be made, or you want to be like, hey, actually, that's not true. That would be my addition.
Yeah.
My name's Olivia.
Yeah, totally. Great questions. I think one thing that I've learned is to not lose sight of my opponent's basic goodness and humanity, and to like catch myself in any patterns to dehumanize someone else, and to remember, and I think Patrice Cullors has been speaking to this really well recently, that like, and Alicia Garza too, of differentiating like the people from the systems, and knowing that like any one of us is like inheriting these systems of oppression, right, and might be repeating them, but we didn't create them. So it's not our fault, but it's our responsibility to like shift things moving forward. And so I've learned that like I can be most effective in my right speech, right? Like I can get someone to my side more if I'm not dehumanizing them, if I'm not coming from a place of judgment and shame. Because like, who wants to be judged? Who feels good being shamed? Who wants to stay in relationship when that's what I'm bringing, right? So remembering again my greatest purpose, and understanding like the human nervous systems and what's gonna allow my message to land. Understanding that hurt people. So someone that, say Putin, who's dehumanizing a whole lot of people, harming a whole lot of people right now, right? He wouldn't be able to do that if he wasn't disconnected inside himself. If he was like totally connected with body, heart, mind, and people around him, he wouldn't be able to enact that great of harm and you know, roll 40 miles of troops down the roads in Ukraine. And so trying to like hold on to the humanity of my opponent, and then in terms of like when the opponent is the people closest to us, right, like people like parents, trying to find compassion, and perhaps for like where they are in their resistance, and what is that resistance about, right? Like a recent example for me is working in birthwork worlds. There's a lot of trans exclusionary radical feminists who really feel defensive of women's spaces and spaces that have historically been women's, such as pregnancy, right? And there's an attack on trans people because they see trans people as the ones that are interfering with that space, but their protection of women's spaces to begin with come out of a need to be safe from sexism and misogyny. So that's really where it's at. Like it's not about me. It's about sexism and misogyny. And so if I can keep my eyes on that and like trust that like they're just like aiming their vitriol in really ineffective directions, but that we all perhaps want to protect women, right? As well as lots of other gendered beings on the planet. So when I get caught in like a they're wrong kind of dynamic, then it doesn't allow me to like find like where is the pain point? Where does it hurt, as Ruby Sales says? Because if I can find where it hurts, then there's a possibility of connection. If I can find connection, then there's a possibility of transformation. And I wonder, with parents, like one of the tools I've used with my dad died when I was young, so I don't get to work this out with him, but with my mom again and again is like trying to connect through our shared values. She raised me with like a value of fairness, with which like for me now with a justice politic doesn't quite go far enough for me towards like equity or justice, but I can connect with her. Like I also want like what I think she's conceived of as fairness. Like I also want that. And so, yeah, to the person to the right of the screen that brought up the parents, I'm wondering like, what are the shared values that you can connect with them on, and kind of remind them that like from that place of values, it's worth shifting their politics or their language, because they're like, if they're really living their values, like they would.
Jacoby, I wanted to add, like, part of these embodied practices is allowing us to be in that state where we're not in that binary SM, right? That when we're in sympathetic arousal, there's an enemy and they're wrong. And what you're inviting us to do in situations where, we feel attacked or we feel, when that's happening, again, without embodied practices, what you're suggesting is almost impossible, right? That on a physiological level, when we're in a sympathetic arousal state and our amygdala is firing, we don't have access to nuance. We don't have access to seeing and feeling the humanity of that person. We just feel like we're being attacked, right? So I just want to bridge so much of what you talk about in the book, right? And what we're doing in this class, right? These things that allow us to be skillful cannot happen if we're not attending to our own nervous system, right? And, there's the things that we do in the moment, and then there's the things that we do to allow us to have something we can do in the moment, right? To get grounded takes practice. You're not going to practice it when you're feeling attacked, right? And I wonder, Jacoby, if you can speak to the distinction between discharge, like releasing, and then like regulating so we can be skillful, because those are slightly different things.
I hope I do you right by answering that question, because so much of what I learned about that, I learned from you. One of the thoughts that comes up is what we practice grows stronger, right? And the neuroplasticity of our brains. And so every time we practice grounding, it's creating the potential for us to ground in the future. There's a quote that I often think of and bring up in my teaching from Jackie Chan, which is, "Under duress, we don't rise to the level of our aspirations, we fall to the level of our training. And so every time I'm on the mat, every time I'm on the cushion, I remind myself that like, this is what I'm training myself for, so that when Trump is elected, so that when war is happening around the world, I've trained myself for that moment. I've practiced for that moment. Because there's a greater possibility of grounding and resourcing and regulating if I have something to fall back on. I guess for me, the discharge practices is either really vocal or really physical. Shouting, yelling, screaming, singing, stomping, dancing, running, boxing, going to batting cages, anything that's like a physical release or a vocal release. But then, yeah, like taking deep breaths, or I've learned from you, Hala, like looking around, like moving the skull on the top vertebra, or using our senses to like feel into this present moment. Like, what does it smell like in the midst of this protest? What is the like smallest, quietest sound that I can hear right now, which like demands that I pay attention and I'm coming to the present moment. Our senses, calling upon our senses, are like a great tool to do that. What am I tasting in my mouth right now? What does the texture of my shirt feel like against my skin? Which is very different than like going for a run and working it out.
And I think too, like some discharge practices are relational, like being able to have our inner circle where we're like, can I just say this thing? And it's awful and terrible, and I just need to say it. And so that it doesn't come out energetically. So there's also relational discharge of, again, and when we're not doing it consciously, it becomes gossip, right? So the difference between gossip and discharge might be the same word, like, this fucking stupid idiot, what did they do? But like, whatever we want to say. I know there's times where I go to my closest people and I'm like, can I just be an asshole for a minute? I just need to, right? So that energy is released, right?
Yeah.
That's okay, right? Jacoby?
So kind, true, and necessary. But I think also building on that, so Adrienne Marie Brown has this idea of woes, working on excellence, right? So there's the folks that you have that you're intimately connected to and can be vulnerable with, and you're working on excellence together, which means you're also dealing with failure and challenge and falling short of your expectations for yourself and others, but in community. So Jacoby and I are woes, and we talk about when we're failing our own high expectations for being loving and kind and patient and courageous, or when others are maybe failing that for us in a moment, and how we can feel the pain of it, and then how we can be vulnerable around the hardship, and then also where we see each other like grow and like, just holding each other, right? Just holding space for that. And I think it's a little different than the venting piece, but it includes that. And it's also a place that there is some level of accountability, right? But there's a lot of tenderness, right? What does Princess Hill say? That accountability, holding someone accountable, the emphasis should be on holding, right? And so it's really, how do we hold each other? Because I have all these ideas of how I want to be this amazing person in the world, and then can I have someone who can hold me lovingly accountable, and be truthful and honest with me, and also make space for me to be really vulnerable about it. And that to me is a really, it might be your best friend, but it also might be someone with whom you have this common shared value around justice and also vulnerability.
Yeah, totally. I think also like Booker is someone else that I would call one of my woes, that that we can call upon when like something's not right about this. Can I work this out with you? And like, yeah, say all the things that are totally unrefined and maybe reactions and maybe come out of my wounds. But my wounds really intimately. And so I don't have any kind of fear that you're going to like judge them. But that we can like get to a skillful place together. Ultimately, two hearts or many hearts are stronger than one.
Yeah. I think we might have time for one more. We do have to get off like 5 minutes early, Jacoby, to set them up for next week's session. But
Okay.
one more question or comment, anybody?
Next week's session is a hike if you want to run out here for that, by the way.
Yes, I do.
Quick little trip from Salt Lake. Exactly.
Yeah. Well, maybe before you go, Jacoby, if there's anything you might just want to close with, again, you know, for this group of budding activists that are, you know, all already quite, you know, radical and engaged and thinking about so much. You know, this is a really special group of folks here, and, you know, balancing the overwhelm of, like, you know, I think of this generation that you all, like, in the palm of your hand, have access to so much stimulation, like, on top of already what's going on in your lives, you know, and I can feel it. I can feel the, like, I don't know that it's more overwhelming, but to me it looks like it's more overwhelming. I'm really glad I did not have the internet when I was in college in some ways. Like an added burden. And the self-care can be even more important. So just if there's anything you might want to close with our people.
Yeah, I'd love to offer, there's some equanimity phrases that my colleague La Sarmiento put up on social media yesterday that have been really powerful to me in this moment of war. So I was wondering if we could work with that together. So sit yourself up in a way that you're paying attention. You feel connected to the ground. Maybe close the computer, turn your phone over so you don't see that. You might allow yourself to get quiet and still and notice what's happening around you. If that's sounds or smells, movement of air. And then offering to yourself, may I be open, peaceful, and balanced. May I be open, peaceful, and balanced. May I have the wisdom to discern my body, heart, and mind's capacity to show up for life wholeheartedly. May I have the wisdom to discern my body, heart, and mind's capacity to show up for life wholeheartedly. Repeating inwardly, may I learn to see the arising and passing of all things with equanimity and ease. May I learn to see the arising and passing of all things with equanimity and ease. May I be able to care for and nurture myself so I can attend to the needs of others with generosity, balance, and presence. May I be able to care for and nurture myself so that I can attend to the needs of others with generosity, balance, and presence. May I remember the humanity of those who cause great harm, and also still hold them accountable for their actions, set boundaries, and defend myself and others. May I remember the humanity of those who cause great harm, and also still hold them accountable for their actions, set boundaries, and defend myself and others. May I take time to make room for and work through the pain and feelings coursing through my being, and to reflect on what would best serve myself, others, and this world, so that we can act with wisdom and compassion to defeat greed, hatred, and delusion. May I take time to make room for and work through the pain and feelings coursing through my being, and to reflect on what would best serve myself, others, and this world, so that we can act with wisdom and compassion to defeat greed, hatred, and delusion. Let's take a deep breath in. Exhale through your mouth. Do that again, this time exhaling with sound. And then this time a deep breath in through your nose and a steady breath out through your nose. If you'd like to, you might bring your hands together at your heart, saluting your readings, saluting one another, saluting all those who have come before to set the grounds for our practice together today. Thank you all so much.
Jacoby, thank you so much for making time to be with us. Really, really appreciate it. Thank you for writing your beautiful book. And I'll talk to you soon. Thank you.
Talk to you Friday morning at 9.
Friday morning at 9.